All my life, I helped others. I worked as an administrator at a clinic, cared for my husband after surgery, raised my son on my own, and when it was my turn to grow old, he wanted to get rid of me like an old armchair. What he didn't know was that the house he grew up in was in my name, and without my signature, he couldn't get a single cent. So when he tried to send me to a nursing home, I simply pulled out the documents and watched him turn pale. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Marilyn Baxter. I was 67 years old and had recently retired after nearly 4 decades working as a medical office administrator. I had spent most of my adult life in upstate New York, but after my husband passed and the winters started to feel longer than they used to, I packed my things and moved back into the house where my story had truly begun. Our family home in rural Virginia. The house had good bones, built in the early 60s, brick and cedar, with a front porch that faced the hills and an attic full of dust-covered memories. It was the house where I'd raised my son, Ronald, where I had planted the rose bushes with my husband after our 20th anniversary, where I had learned the rhythm of the creaking floors and the click of the furnace when it kicked on in the middle of the night. Coming back felt like pulling on an old sweater, slightly faded, slightly stretched, but still warm, still mine. Ronald and his wife Karen had suggested moving in with me shortly after my retirement. Their daughter, Lacey, my only grandchild, was just entering 6th grade, and they said it would be easier for everyone to be together. Karen had a lifestyle blog and worked from home. Ronald was a real estate agent. They said they could help with the property, take care of the lawn, manage repairs, handle the bills, and in exchange, they'd have more room and I'd have company. It sounded like a win-win. At the time, I welcomed the idea. I was getting older, and the idea of having family close gave me comfort. For the first few months, everything settled into a quiet routine. I cooked breakfast most mornings, scrambled eggs, toast, sometimes pancakes on weekends. Karen would join me with her laptop open, typing between bites. Lacey would sit at the counter doing homework or scrolling on her phone. Ronald usually left early for work, but always kissed me on the cheek and said, "Thanks, Mom," as he grabbed his coffee. I did laundry without being asked. I organized the pantry. I dusted the bookshelves and restocked the paper towels. I ironed Ronald's shirts the way I used to when he was in high school, even though he didn't ask me to. It just felt natural. I had always found purpose in small tasks. The house hummed with familiar rhythms. I was happy to be useful. When Lacey got sick in October, I stayed up through the night with her, placing cool cloths on her forehead, reading her chapters from old paperbacks that used to be her father's. Karen slept through most of it. In the morning, she thanked me distractedly while posting pictures of her smoothie on Instagram. I didn't mind. I didn't do it for thanks. I found a kind of joy in being the quiet, dependable presence in the house. I kept the coffee pot warm. I reminded Karen to pay the electric bill when she forgot. I picked up groceries on Thursdays and always added a few extra treats for Lacey. Cinnamon granola bars, the kind she liked in her lunch. I thought we were building something together. A shared home, a patchwork of lives stitched by the comfort of family. But slowly, things began to shift. At first, it was small. A door that used to stay open began to close more often. Laughter drifted from behind it, but I wasn't part of the joke. The grocery list on the fridge, once something we all contributed to, now had a note in Karen's handwriting. "Please ask before adding." When I rearranged the spice rack one day, purely out of habit, I noticed it had been changed back the next morning. Still, I told myself it was normal, adjustments, boundaries. We were three adults and a child sharing a space. There would be friction, but I wasn't prepared for how quickly the warmth would evaporate. By Thanksgiving, I no longer sat at the head of the table. Karen took over hosting duties, which I understood, but she also stopped asking for my help. I offered to cook the stuffing, the cranberry sauce, even just mash the potatoes, but she smiled tightly and said she had it all covered. I watched as she plated store-bought dishes on antique china and called it homemade. When guests complimented the food, I stayed quiet. There was no place for my hands anymore, and increasingly it felt like there was no place for my voice. Ronald stayed cheerful but distracted. He was often on the phone, pacing the hallway, always closing a deal or checking in on a listing. He stopped saying, "Thanks, Mom," in the mornings. Some days, he didn't come into the kitchen at all. I still made breakfast. I still folded the laundry. I still bought the granola bars. I told myself I was imagining the distance, that families went through seasons, that things would level out. But deep down, I started to feel it, a quiet tightening in my chest, a creeping sensation that the walls of my own house were inching closer, room by room. The dining room I once filled with birthday parties and holiday songs now echoed with the sound of whispered conversations I wasn't meant to hear. I tried not to let it sting. I reminded myself that they had busy lives, that Lacey was growing up, that maybe I needed to step back. But at night, when the house grew dark and I sat alone in my room folding towels that didn't belong to me, I wondered, was this still my home? Or had I become a guest in my own life? The kitchen had always been my sanctuary. It was the heart of the house, the place where smells lingered and stories were told between teaspoons of sugar and splashes of cream. I had spent most of my life nurturing people across that tiled floor, feeding, listening, washing, tending. But now, something about the air in that room had changed. It wasn't just that the mornings were quieter. It was the way the silence stretched between us, not from lack of words, but from a lack of welcome. At first, it was subtle. I would walk in to make coffee and find that someone had already brewed a fresh pot, but only enough for 2 cups. When I'd refill the sugar bowl, it would be replaced later that day with a different container, one I didn't recognize. Things moved. My measuring spoons disappeared from their usual drawer and turned up days later in a box labeled "Declutter." I found a donation bag in the hallway with one of my aprons folded neatly inside. Karen had started spending more time in the kitchen, not cooking, but filming. Her phone, propped on a tripod near the window, captured her as she blended kale smoothies or chopped cucumbers in precise influencer-ready slices. Her smile in those moments was radiant, curated. But when I entered mid-recording, that smile would vanish as quickly as it appeared. She never told me to leave. She didn't need to. Her expression was enough. I began to avoid the kitchen during certain hours, retreating to my room until I heard her heels click out across the hardwood floor. Ronald, once so affectionate and joking, had turned distant. His voice, when directed at me, grew clipped. He spoke to me the way he spoke to clients on speakerphone. Efficient, polite, impatient. He no longer asked how I slept or if I needed anything from the store. He stopped mentioning the weather or the news or how good my biscuits smelled in the oven. He walked into the kitchen, grabbed what he needed, and walked out again. No eye contact, no pause. Then came the doors. One day, I went to fold a load of laundry and found the door to the guest room. What used to be Lacey's playroom and now served as an office for Karen, locked. I paused, confused. It had never been locked before. The next day, the door to the basement was locked too. When I asked Ronald if something was wrong with the doorknob, he shrugged and said, "Just trying to keep things organized." No further explanation. I didn't push, but I began to notice a pattern. Room by room, my access shrank. Even Lacey changed. She had once come home from school and rushed to tell me about her day, plopping her backpack at the foot of the chair while I peeled apples for her snack. Now she went straight to her room, earbuds in, her eyes flicking past me like I was a shadow. I missed her most of all. The way she used to curl up next to me during stormy nights, how she'd rest her head on my shoulder while we watched cooking shows together. Now, I barely saw her. One morning, I overheard Karen on a video call with someone. She was pacing through the kitchen, talking softly, but I caught the words guest house and long-term investment. She said something about maximizing square footage and potential renovation options. I stepped back into the hallway before she saw me, heart pounding. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the ceiling, playing those words over in my mind like a puzzle I wasn't meant to solve. A few days later, I saw unfamiliar shoes near the front door. Shiny leather, pointed toes, definitely not Ronald's. I heard voices drifting from the dining room, low and measured, businesslike. I walked past quietly and caught a glimpse of a man in a tailored blazer holding a rolled-up floor plan. He was gesturing toward the walls. I froze. Ronald stood beside him, nodding. That night, I stayed up late. I waited until the house had gone still and dark. Then I pulled my small key box from the closet, the one with my wedding rings and old tax records and hospital badges, and from the very bottom, I pulled out the key to the safe hidden behind the dresser in the master bedroom. The house was quiet as I moved, but I felt every creak beneath my slippers like a warning. I opened the safe and sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping through manila folders I hadn't touched in years. Deeds, trust agreements, copies of legal filings, and there it was, tucked between a copy of my birth certificate and a notarized letter from the bank, proof of ownership, my name, clear, undeniable. Ronald could walk every inch of this house with buyers. He could gesture at the square footage, describe open concept potential, talk about upgrades and value. But none of it mattered without me. Not legally, not financially. They had forgotten something essential. I wasn't just a quiet old woman in the kitchen. I was the owner of the house, and they still needed me. That thought kept me warm that night, not out of spite, out of clarity. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in months. The kind of steady, quiet determination that settles into your bones when something finally clicks into place. I didn't rush. I made my tea like I always did, fed the birds out back, sat for a moment in the armchair by the window where the sun warmed the cushion just right. But beneath the calm was movement, a current building quietly beneath the surface. After breakfast, I went to the hall closet and pulled down the old cedar box where I kept things from my working years. It was dusty and heavy and smelled faintly of old receipts and wood polish. Inside were remnants of a life spent keeping things in order. Retirement letters, hospital certificates, a few thank you cards from co-workers. But what I needed wasn't in the box itself. I pulled the false bottom up with care, revealing a slim, dark brown leather folder. I hadn't touched it in nearly 8 years. It was the folder my husband and I had used when we updated the title to the house after he got sick. We had met with a lawyer to ensure things were clear, that the home would pass securely to me if something happened. I remembered sitting in that office, clutching my purse, listening to the lawyer explain probate and transfer of ownership, while my husband, pale and tired, nodded along. He had insisted we put it all in my name. "This house is yours," he'd said. "You've taken care of it longer than I have." At the time, I didn't think much of it. It felt ceremonial, practical. But now, years later, That decision had become the quiet line between my dignity and my displacement. I opened the folder carefully. Inside were 3 neatly clipped packets of documents: the deed to the house, listing me as sole owner, a durable power of attorney with my name as the only signer, and a notarized letter confirming that any sale or transfer of the property required my explicit written consent. I ran my fingers over the notary seal, the raised circle pressed into the page like a quiet reminder of something unshakable. My name, in full, in ink, permanent. I read through every page again, slowly. My eyes scanned the paragraphs, recognizing phrases like non-transferable without written authorization and legal rights reserved to party of title. Every line felt like a thread stitching me back into the center of something I'd almost let slip away. The folder also contained something else: my updated will. I had revised it the year after my husband died. At the time, I wasn't thinking of leverage or statements. I just wanted to leave something meaningful to my granddaughter. So I had listed Lacey as the beneficiary of the house, not Ronald, not Karen. I had made that choice in a moment of quiet affection, thinking about how Lacey used to help me pick tomatoes from the garden and fold laundry on rainy afternoons. Now that choice had a different kind of weight. I closed the folder and held it in my lap. Outside, I could hear Lacey's footsteps overhead, the soft thud of her school bag hitting the floor, Karen's voice on another video call, and somewhere in the distance, Ronald's car pulling into the driveway. Life upstairs moved on as if nothing had changed, but everything had. I didn't go upstairs. I didn't make dinner. I didn't fold laundry or water the plants. Instead, I slipped the folder beneath my pillow and sat back down in my armchair. I stared out at the trees swaying in the wind, the soft gold of afternoon light stretching across the yard. Later that evening, as I made myself a small dinner of soup and crackers, Ronald entered the kitchen. He had that careful, rehearsed expression he wore when trying to seem casual. He asked if I'd thought more about the assisted living facility he mentioned last week. "Just a short stay," he said, "so you can rest, get some space. Let us handle things for a while." I looked at him steadily. I didn't argue. I didn't confront. I simply smiled as gently as I could and said I'd think about it. He seemed satisfied by that, but in my mind, something had shifted. He didn't know what was hidden beneath my pillow. He didn't know that every word he said now echoed against the facts that lived in that folder. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't unsure. I had leverage, and for the first time in a long time, I knew exactly what that meant. It started with the smell of fresh paint. One morning, I came downstairs to find the front hallway had been repainted a bright neutral beige. The family portraits that once lined the staircase wall had been taken down, replaced by a set of identical abstract prints. I stood at the base of the stairs, staring at the clean, blank space where memories used to live, and something in my chest tightened. When I asked Karen about it, she said it was just a little refresh. She added that the house needed a modern look if we wanted to keep up appearances. I didn't ask what appearances needed keeping. I already knew. By the end of that week, the dining room table had been stripped of its old linen runner and set with white plates and gray napkins, neatly rolled and tied with twine. The windows had been washed, the rugs replaced, the throw pillows rearranged. I watched it all happen around me, like I was a ghost in my own home. Karen coordinated it all with the precision of a showroom designer, snapping photos as she fluffed cushions and adjusted lighting. Then, on Sunday afternoon, people started arriving. At first, I thought it was a family gathering. I had baked a pie earlier in the day and was wearing my soft blue sweater, the one Lacey said made me look like a cozy grandma. I heard the sound of the front door opening and the murmur of voices. But these weren't relatives. These were strangers. A man in a tailored gray suit, a woman in heels so high, I wondered how she navigated our gravel driveway. Another couple holding iced coffees, whispering to each other as they surveyed the living room. Ronald greeted them with a wide, rehearsed smile. He handed out glossy brochures and gestured toward the kitchen like a magician revealing a trick. I watched from my armchair as he pointed out the open layout, the charming breakfast nook, the mature landscaping out back. His voice had that bright, inflated tone he used when he wanted to impress, the tone he used to use when he spoke about his career before it ever really took off. I realized then what this was. A showing. He was showing my house, without a word to me, without a hint of hesitation. They wandered through the rooms like tourists in a museum, opening closet doors, running fingers across countertops, asking questions about the square footage and the age of the HVAC system. I sat still, hands folded in my lap, watching my life be dissected like a property listing. Then one of the visitors, a balding man in khakis and boat shoes, turned to Ronald and asked, "And the owner? Will she be vacating before closing, or is there a timeline?" Ronald smiled, tight, awkward, and said something vague. "We're working on that." The man nodded politely, glanced at me, and said, "Oh, is that her?" He sounded surprised, like I was a leftover piece of furniture no one had cleared from the room. I met his eyes and straightened in my chair. "Yes," I said, "I'm the owner." He blinked. The woman next to him looked away. There was an awkward silence. Ronald cleared his throat, then quickly ushered them into the sunroom to check out the natural light. No one made eye contact with me after that. The rest of the group trickled out within minutes, their curiosity noticeably diminished. When the door finally closed behind the last guest, Ronald didn't look at me. He walked past, muttering something about miscommunication and timing. Karen followed him silently, her expression unreadable. Lacey didn't come downstairs at all. That night, the house felt different, colder, emptier. Not because the guests had come and gone, but because the truth had settled like dust in the corners. Ronald had moved forward with a plan that didn't include me. He had orchestrated a presentation, a sale, a transaction, in my home, with my walls, my floors, my life, and treated me like an afterthought, a box to be checked, a hurdle to be managed. But he had made one mistake. He had done it without my signature, and now he knew that I knew. I lay in bed that night with the leather folder beside me, unopened but near. I didn't need to look at the documents again. I had them memorized by now. What I needed was the reminder of what they meant. They meant that this house wasn't his to sell. They meant that I was not, and never would be, invisible. They meant that the next move would be mine. The next morning, the energy in the house had shifted. It wasn't loud or obvious. It was quiet in the way tension always is, clinging to the walls, thickening the air in every room. No one said anything about the day before. Not over breakfast, not in passing, not even when I stood in the doorway of the kitchen while Karen reheated coffee that I had brewed just an hour earlier. Her eyes met mine for only a second before she looked back down at her mug. Ronald didn't leave for work that morning. Instead, he lingered around the house, pacing from room to room, as if looking for a reason to talk to me without knowing how. He cleared his throat once when I passed him in the hallway. I kept walking. By late afternoon, he finally spoke. He found me in the garden, kneeling near the rose bush I had trimmed the week before. It hadn't bloomed yet, but the buds were promising, tight and full of quiet potential. I had my gloves on, shears in hand, and I didn't look up when he approached. He called me Mom in that soft, carefully rehearsed tone I hadn't heard since before he graduated college. I stood and brushed off my hands. He followed me inside. He had laid out everything on the dining table: the paperwork, the folders, a pen. It was all there, waiting like some carefully set stage, a performance of sincerity. He gestured toward the chair at the head of the table, the one I hadn't sat in since Karen started hosting holidays. I sat across from him instead. He started by reminiscing. He talked about childhood memories, the time we built a cardboard fort in the living room and slept in it for 2 nights, the Halloween I hand-sewed his costume when we couldn't afford the one he wanted, the year I worked overtime to pay for his baseball trip. All true stories, all genuine memories, but none of them served as answers to the question he wouldn't ask directly. Finally, he picked up the papers and placed them in front of me. He called it a simple formality. He said it would help everyone, that it was just a signature. I didn't respond. Instead, I walked to the living room and returned with the leather folder. I laid it gently beside his papers. I didn't need to speak. I opened the folder slowly, deliberately, and slid out 2 documents. One was the deed to the house. The second was my will. I placed them side by side. His eyes moved quickly across the pages, trying to process what he was looking at. I watched his face change when he saw the name on the beneficiary line. Lacey, not him. His mouth parted slightly. He looked up at me, pale, uncertain. Still, I said nothing. He reached for the pen again, trying to recover the moment, as if some balance could still be restored, but it was already gone. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse him. I didn't ask him why he thought I wouldn't notice. I simply stood, gathered the documents, and placed them back in the folder with a calmness that came not from anger, but from control. He sat frozen for a few seconds longer, still trying to rewrite the moment in his mind. But it had already been written by me. I walked past him, back into the kitchen, and poured myself a glass of water. The sound of the faucet echoed through the quiet house. Behind me, I heard the soft shuffle of paper being gathered, the creak of the dining room chair, and eventually the slow, uncertain footsteps as he made his way down the hall. He didn't speak to me for the rest of the day, and I didn't need him to. There was nothing left to negotiate. The sun rose slowly that morning, bleeding through the blinds in thin streaks of gold. I had barely slept, but I didn't feel tired. Instead, I felt something clearer than exhaustion, something sharper. I stood by the window with a cup of tea that had gone cold in my hands, staring out at the yard, at the bird bath my husband and I had installed so many years ago. The robins were back for spring, chirping without concern, hopping between puddles of yesterday's rain. I had always believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt, in patience, in quiet strength. I had built my life around those values, at work, in marriage, in motherhood. I held things together because I believed that was what love looked like. That was what being dependable meant. But I had come to learn that being dependable didn't mean being disposable, and I was done pretending the two were the same. That morning, while the rest of the house slept, I packed, not my own bags, but theirs. I started with the hallway closet, where Ronald kept his spare jackets and golf bag he never used. Then I moved to the bedroom down the hall. I folded his clothes neatly, shirts, slacks, socks, and placed them into a box. Karen's blazers, makeup cases, decorative throw pillows she used for her video backdrops. All of it went into labeled containers. I wrapped the fragile things in old towels, not out of care for the items, but because that's who I was. Careful, thoughtful, even in this. The guest bathroom came next. Lacey's things I left untouched. She had been a child in all this, pulled along by tides she hadn't created. Her visits had grown less frequent, but she had never been unkind. I packed her parents' belongings and left the space as it had been before they moved in, clean, neutral, ready to be reclaimed. I moved slowly, methodically, like someone cleaning a wound before stitching it shut. By the time Ronald came downstairs, the boxes were stacked by the front door. He didn't speak right away. He looked at them, then at me, then back again. I told him it was time, that they had other options, that they were young, capable, perfectly able to live independently. I said I had believed we were building something together, but now I saw that I had simply been holding still while they planned their escape. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply stated the truth. Karen appeared shortly after, her eyes wide, mascara smudged beneath one lash. She said something I didn't hear. Her words were soft and frantic, a mix of protest and panic, but I didn't respond. I walked to the table and placed a set of keys in the center. Keys to the house, to the garage, to the gate lock they had changed without asking me. Ronald said he didn't understand, that this was his home too, that we were family. I told him family didn't lock doors to keep you out of your own house. Family didn't hold secret meetings with realtors and smile through rehearsed conversations while plotting to remove you. Family didn't treat your existence like a technicality. He said I was being unfair. I let the words hang in the air, heavy and hollow. Then I turned away and walked out to the porch, where the wind was soft and the sky was turning that hopeful shade of blue that only comes with morning. They left that evening. There was no dramatic farewell, no slamming doors, no final pleas, just the slow, quiet shuffle of boxes, the back and forth of footsteps on the gravel, the sound of a car door closing one last time. I stood in the living room, the space they had tried to erase me from, and I breathed. For the first time in a long while, the house felt like mine again, not because I had won, but because I had chosen. I wasn't exiling anyone. I was reclaiming peace. I made myself dinner, roasted vegetables and rice. I played classical music low in the background and lit the candle I'd been saving. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I didn't check for messages. I went to bed early, and for the first time in months, I slept all the way through the night. The silence after they left was not the kind that echoed. It didn't howl through empty rooms or settle into my chest like grief. It was a different kind of silence, soft, steady, like the sound of a page turning in a quiet library. It took me a few days to stop expecting footsteps in the hallway, to stop setting out extra plates without thinking. But once the echoes of routine faded, something else began to take shape. Space, breath, stillness that felt like mine. I started with the walls. The living room had been painted a pale gray by Karen, probably for her videos. It had always felt cold to me. So I bought a few cans of paint in a warm shade of cream with a touch of yellow. I took my time. It wasn't just about color. It was about reclaiming every brushstroke. Each layer covered more than just old paint. It covered the way they looked past me, the way they closed doors, the way they planned my absence like it was inevitable. Once the walls were done, I rearranged the furniture. I moved the bookshelf back under the front window where it used to be, where the morning light hit just right. I donated the minimalist white coffee table Karen had brought in and replaced it with the one from the attic, the one with a chip in the corner and tea rings from the time Ronald was 12 and insisted on drinking grown-up tea without a coaster. I cleaned it carefully and polished it until it glowed. In the kitchen, I unpacked my old dishes, the mismatched floral set with tiny chips along the edges. I found my grandmother's serving platter wrapped in an old towel in the garage and placed it back in the center cabinet, right where it belonged. I baked a cherry pie one afternoon, and the smell wrapped around the house like a memory made new again. That night, I cut a slice and ate it in front of the fireplace, wrapped in the same quilt I'd sewn the year my husband got sick. I joined a book club at the local library. I hadn't been part of any group in years, not since before retirement. The first meeting felt awkward, like trying on clothes that didn't quite fit, but the second felt better. The third felt natural. We read novels, memoirs, poetry. I brought cookies once, and they disappeared within minutes. Someone complimented my laugh. I hadn't realized how long it had been since I laughed around other people. I started driving again, not just to the store or the post office. I took long drives through the countryside, letting the windows down and the breeze in. I stopped at roadside markets and picked up fresh apples, hand-churned butter, homemade jam. I learned to take the long way home just because I could. On Saturdays, I gardened. I pulled weeds, planted lavender, rearranged the flower beds until my knees ached and my back protested. But it was a good ache, the kind that reminded you of your body, of your will. I replanted the hydrangeas near the porch, the ones Ronald said were too messy. I didn't care. They were mine. Sometimes Lacey came to visit. She never called ahead, never brought her parents. She'd knock softly, smiling in that shy way she had as a child. I'd let her in, and we'd sit at the kitchen table with cocoa and cookies. She told me about school, about her friends, about her dream of becoming a photographer. She asked about old family photos, and we spent hours going through albums, her fingers gently tracing the edges of pictures she'd never seen before. I didn't press. I didn't ask what her parents told her. I just listened. One afternoon, she showed me a picture she had taken of the rose bush in bloom. It was beautiful, soft focus, golden hour lighting, perfectly framed. She had titled it, Still Growing. I felt something in my chest shift, and I reached for her hand without thinking. She squeezed mine. I never spoke badly about her parents. I didn't need to. The truth lived in the spaces between what we said and what we didn't. The house felt full again, not with people, but with life, with intention, with mornings spent reading in the armchair, afternoons in the garden, evenings filled with the hum of music playing softly from the radio. I had thought that growing older would mean shrinking, fading, becoming background, but in reality, it meant returning to myself, to the quiet strength I had always carried. I no longer waited for calls that didn't come. I no longer looked at the front door with expectation or dread. I no longer gave my time to those who treated it like spare change. I had made a decision, and it had given me back everything they thought they could take. This was my home. This was my life, and it was just beginning again. It arrived on a Thursday morning, folded neatly in a manila envelope with a printed label and no return address. Even before I turned it over in my hands, I felt its weight, not just the paper, but the intent behind it. It had the heaviness of something presumptuous, something already decided, at least in the mind of the sender. I brought it into the kitchen and set it down beside my tea and half-finished crossword puzzle. The teacup had cooled, a faint circle of condensation blooming on the wood table beneath it. Outside, birds chirped lazily from the oak tree, the branches casting slow-moving shadows across the floor as the light filtered through the blinds. I didn't open the envelope right away. I studied it, ran my fingers over the smooth surface. I thought about all the mail that had come through this house over the decades. Birthday cards, bills, holiday newsletters from old friends, catalogs addressed to my husband. This envelope didn't belong to that world. It belonged to the new one, where words like equity and liquidation replaced home and memory. Eventually, I opened it. The contents were clinical: 10 pages of real estate documents, neatly stapled and bound, lines of type in a cold serif font, parcel numbers, market assessments, timeline projections, legal clauses so detached in tone they might as well have been written in code, and 3 blank lines waiting for my signature, each one preceded by my full name, Marilyn Elaine Baxter, a name I had carried with dignity for over 67 years. I read the cover letter last. It was brief, businesslike. Ronald's tone came through in every word. He had chosen language that was careful but not kind, in the best interest of the family. As discussed. Necessary next steps. Not once did he ask. Not once did he acknowledge the history, the walls, the memories. There was no mention of the tree I planted the year he was born, or the night he scraped his knee, and I sat on the porch holding him close, whispering lullabies until the pain gave way to sleep. No room for sentiment in a transaction. I sat with the papers for a long time. The world outside moved on as if nothing had changed. A dog barked in the distance. A truck rolled down the street. The tulips swayed gently by the fence, catching sunlight on their petals. I felt detached from it all, as if I were floating slightly above the floor. When the tea had gone entirely cold, I stood and went to my room. From the drawer of my nightstand, I retrieved the leather folder I had kept close these past months, sometimes under my pillow, sometimes tucked beneath a stack of books. It was worn at the edges but still firm, reliable. Inside were the documents that told my side of the story. The deed, with my name alone on the title. The power of attorney, drafted in a time when I believed Ronald would protect, not exploit. The will, revised quietly, intentionally, where everything I owned, especially this house, would someday belong to my granddaughter, Lacey. I returned to the kitchen and placed the folder beside Ronald's envelope. The contrast was striking. His stack filled with expectation, mine with resolution. I pulled a clean sheet of paper from the drawer, smoothed it on the table, and began to write. The words came easily. I didn't rehearse or cross anything out. I wrote that I would not be signing the documents, that the house was not simply property, not a figure on a spreadsheet, but a space built by hands and held together by memory, that I was not an obstacle in someone else's plan. I was the rightful owner of my own life. I signed it. My signature was not rushed. I wrote each letter carefully, pressing just hard enough to leave an indentation beneath the ink. Then I folded the page, sealed it in an envelope, and added it to the outgoing mail bin by the door. No fanfare, no theatrics, just clarity. Later, I sat on the porch and watched the clouds shift. The wind had picked up slightly, carrying the scent of soil and distant rain. It wasn't the end of something. It was a boundary, a new edge drawn where the old ones had been smudged by years of giving too much. That evening, I made dinner for one. Baked salmon with rosemary, roasted carrots, a glass of wine. I lit a candle in the center of the table, not because I was lonely, but because it felt right to make something beautiful for myself. I played a record, an old one with soft piano and hushed strings. The music filled the space without overwhelming it. Afterward, I washed the dishes slowly, dried them with care, and placed them neatly back in their places. No one called, no one came by, and yet the house felt full for the first time in a very long time. I slid Ronald's documents into the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, behind old tax returns and outdated manuals, not out of spite, but because they no longer held power. They were just paper, proposals without permission, And that signature, the one I refused to give, meant more than a denial. It was a reclamation, a full sentence in a story I had been quiet in for too long. It meant the house stayed mine. It meant the silence was peace. It meant I still had a voice, and I had used it.